Welcome to episode 68 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, all spelled out, so seven-health.com/68.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. This week I have another guest and it's one I'm really excited about. I'm speaking with Evelyn Tribole. So Evelyn is an award-winning registered dietitian specializing in eating disorders and intuitive eating with a private practice in Newport Beach, California. She's written 7 books, including the bestseller Intuitive Eating, which she co-authored with Elyse Resch. Evelyn was the nutrition expert for Good Morning America in 94 and 95 and was a national spokesperson for the American Dietetic Association for 6 years. She was a contributing editor for Shape magazine, where she had a monthly column called Recipe Makeovers, which appeared for 11 years. And she's often sought out by the media for her nutritional expertise and has appeared on hundreds of interviews, including CNN, Today Show, MSNBC, Fox News, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and People magazine. So I became aware of Evelyn a number of years ago when I first heard of Intuitive Eating, and it's a book that if you haven't read, I suggest that you check it out. It's definitely made an impact on me and made me rethink my role when working with clients and just helped me tweak how I do that. And so as part of today's chat, we go through Evelyn's background and how she got into what she's doing and now how her practice has evolved over time. So she's been practicing now for 20 plus years. So a lot has changed since she first got into this, and we talk about that. We then spend a lot of the time just going through intuitive eating, and she outlines all of the principles and also then talks about food addiction and why, like, without restriction and without dieting, food addiction really doesn't happen. And so Evelyn is a fantastic speaker, and for a lot of the show, I'm pretty quiet, and it's just her going. But I loved everything she had to say, so I was more than happy to just let her do that. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I did, and here is my interview with Evelyn Tribole. So hi, Evelyn. Thanks for being a guest on the show today.
It's my pleasure.
So look, first off, I just want to say a massive thank you for your book, Intuitive Eating, which has had a huge impact on me as a practitioner. It's really the cornerstone of what I do with so many of my clients, and it's so helpful to have a resource that I can just get them to read and to refer to. So just thank you for that to start with.
Well, I have to tell you that it's so gratifying to work with people in this process, and I'm thrilled to hear it's helping you and your clients as well.
Perfect. Well, look, before we go through intuitive eating, and it is something I want to chat with you about today, do you want to give a little bit of a background of yourself, of who you are, what you do for people who don't know who you are?
Sure. Well, I am a registered dietitian in private practice. I actually call myself a nutrition therapist. It's a term we use in the United States because it reflects more that we're working beyond just nutrition. It's more about what is the process, what is the relationship to your eating. So I do that. I also train health professionals in this method. We actually certify health professionals to become certified intuitive eating counselors so that they can also use this method and this work with their clients. And to date, I've written about 9 books. I do a lot of speaking, and I just have a lot of passion for this whole area. So I'm thrilled to be talking with you today about it.
Perfect. And so if we are to go back in time and look at your history with food growing up, what was food like for you? What was it like in your household?
You know, it's a really interesting question. I grew up in a really fortunate way. There was 4 of us kids, and traditional mom and dad. But what was really interesting is my mom spent equal time, I'd say equal money, on buying like the best produce. There was this like amazing produce store near us. So we had tons of fruits and vegetables always available. But she also bought a bunch of what we called at the time just junk food and goodies, you know, like pastries and cakes and those kinds of things. So foods were never off limits for us. And we had a wide variety of choices. And the part that maybe some of your listeners might find interesting is my mom's relationship with food, because I grew up with a dieting mom. I knew what her goal weight was. She was constantly on diets, but the really good thing is she never, ever projected that onto us. She always had her blue milk, which is known as skim, or not fat milk, but it wasn't popular when I was growing up. And so I feel fortunate that I didn't get stuck into the dieting mentality that she had. And probably one of the saddest, most memorable conversations I ever had with my mom was when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at the age of 64. And we were having one of those really deep talks about life and death. And she just looked at me and she said, I can't believe all these years I've spent dieting, and now for this, all I want to do is to live longer and see my grandkids grow up. And so that was just really, really poignant. And to show how profound the dieting mentality still affected my mom, as she was going through her various chemotherapy treatments, one day she called me and was very happy because she lost a bunch of weight. And I was absolutely mortified. It's like, oh my God, this is how sick our culture has become. So that's just some background in terms of my own history. But in terms of my relationship with food, I was also fortunate because I was an athlete growing up, and at a time it wasn't quite as popular for girls to be doing sports. And so I ran the boys' track team, and I was always really concerned about what food can do for my body to help me beat the boys, beat other people. So I never got stuck into, the body image issues that a lot of young girls, and actually boys now these days, are that they struggle with, because our culture back then was very different. But we always had this profound respect for what the body can do and what can I eat in order to make it go faster, as opposed to what can I eat or do to change the shape of my body. That wasn't even an issue, even in college as well. So I was very lucky in that way.
Okay. And you mentioned about your mom's dieting and that you have siblings. Did everyone else in your family kind of get out unscathed, or did they go down the diet route as well?
That's a good question. It's funny. I remember sometimes my dad going along with my mom to diet, and then I have two sisters and a brother, and I know they've dabbled with dieting, but to say whether they were unscathed or not, that's actually a good question. I've never actually asked them that, so it'll be interesting talk around the holidays.
Definitely. And so, at what point then did you decide? I want to train as a dietitian? I know you also mentioned about the sport aspect. Was that part of it? Like, how did that come to be?
Well, that was a huge part of it. I was originally a physical education major. I wanted to be a coach, and at that time things were really changing, and it became clear to me I wasn't going to have a career in this because all the funding was being cut. And I happened to see a nutrition textbook in our student union by some students, and so I waited for the person to come back and ask her about this textbook, and she went on to tell me not only was it a great class she was taking, but you can actually major in it. So I ended up taking that class, changed my major, and I was just fascinated, just beyond, I've got this like inner nerd, this inner geek, because I do love research. I love science. So what originally got me in was about, performance for the body. But what really, I think changed, I'm trying to think of when in my career this happened, maybe 5 years into it, getting more into the psychology of eating. That's what really started to really intrigue me. Because what I found is people had a lot of knowledge, but they often were really challenged by everyday life situations, in terms of why is it that they can't put what they want to do into action. And then as I started working more into eating disorders, that's when things really came to fruition. In fact, I had a really interesting career path because it's very unusual. There was a point I was working for the movie industry for Columbia Pictures, which is now known as Sony Pictures, and it really got me. I had to be working with these very famous celebrities, and they had everything. They had money, they had the fame, but that saying, no matter where you are, there you go. They still had issues with their body and so on. So that really deepened my connection. And eventually I ended up meeting Elyse Resch, my co-author of Intuitive Eating, because I leased an office out from her. And I was getting really frustrated. Actually, we both really were frustrated with traditional dietetics in which, patients would come in and you would prescribe very nice eating plans with food exchanges and so on. And it seemed to be a way to go. It seemed flexible. But what we kept seeing over and over again is that people kept gaining back the weight, coming back in and seeing us. We weren't practicing together, but we saw the same pattern and thinking that there's something wrong with them. And we're like, no, there's something wrong with this process. This is not working. And that's when we really started delving more into the research combined with our clinical experience and finally came up with the guiding principles of intuitive eating.
Okay. And with that, I'm just trying to think, like, you obviously trained as a dietitian.
Yes.
Did you always think you were then going to go into private practice, or did you think you'd work in a hospital setting?
Oh, you know what? I think in my mind, I was always going to be doing something different. I started my first year in a hospital setting, had very good clinical training. But after that, I got into private practice and where I spent half of my time with counseling and the other half with projects, whether it's speaking or doing media work or writing books. And to this day, I still love that variety of writing, delving into some of the research, but and still working with people. It keeps me very fresh and it's very synergized, because it's one thing to know the research, but to put it into really meaningful terms, that's to me is the real art of counseling, and it's part of the art of writing. It's the so what factor. It's the humanity factor.
Yeah. And I think you were on, is it Good Morning America for a really long time?
Well, I was on for about a year and a half, and I will tell you, it's a big national program in the United States, and I was the first dietitian they hired to be their nutritionist, and I got to tell you, I had so much fun.
And so how did that then come about?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to remember, because I've written a lot of books. I've had a lot of media exposure and training, and I was also a spokesperson for the American Dietetic Association. So what ended up happening is I was a guest on their show, and I don't remember why. It was either because I was speaking for the ADA or I was on for some book kind of thing. And then it was a pretty good interview, but then it's so funny how things line up, these little acts of synchronicity, the randomness. Someone was supposed to be a guest and they weren't able to make it, or they had a technical difficulty. I forget what. And all of a sudden, this is live national TV and they needed a segment. And so they asked me, could I stay and do a segment? And I said, sure. And they said, well, we need some ideas. So during the commercial break, I think we had 90 seconds to come up with an idea.
Okay.
And we did. It was one of the best interviews of my life. I ended up talking about primal hunger, and that is when you get so hungry in that critical moment of time, you don't care. You're going to, I'm going to kill someone, get a bagel or something, that kind of urgency that happens. And so they ended up offering me a contract to be their regular nutritionist. And so the rest is history, so to speak. And that was a lot of fun.
Wow. That is pretty fortunate for that to happen like that.
Yeah,
but I assume that you were able to then be able to talk the talk so that they were then keeping you on.
Yeah, it was really fun. Whatever was breaking in the news, I'll never forget. God, what was it? Someone in the New York Times had written something about pasta being unhealthy, that carbs are, quote, bad for you. And it was on the front page of the New York Times. And so Good Morning America saw that, the producers, and said, we need you tomorrow. So it's like, okay, I'm on a plane and talking about how we still need carbs and so on and so on. So, yeah, that was pretty fun.
Wow. And look, you mentioned before about the working with eating disorders, and was this something that you started working on kind of out of necessity because more of these people were ending up in your practice, or is this something you'd always had a real interest in?
That's a really good question. And I think it was a combination of a couple of things. I ended up, believe it or not, doing full day trainings on eating disorders because I was asked to do that. And I really, really enjoyed the topic. And simultaneously, out of necessity, I started getting patients with eating disorders. And the more, as you know, when you start working with people with eating disorders, it's so complex. And then you're working with a team, you're working with, minimally a psychologist and usually a physician who specializes in eating disorders. And that it's such a relational kind of experience. You're not just telling somebody what to do. You're figuring out what are the fears and the beliefs that are they're impacting what it is that they're doing for their body, and trying to figure it out. Well, what is it they need in order to feel safe, and yet still move one step further in terms of their recovery. And to this day, it's probably one of the most gratifying areas I have in my practice. I mean, between working with chronic dieters, but then also working with people with eating disorders and getting them into recovery, and the fact that recovery is possible. It's not a life sentence. And for so many of a lot of women, but I have a fair amount of boys and men as well, there's so much shame that's surrounded by that. And often they're surprised to learn that, yeah, this is a pattern. If you've been starving yourself, of course you're going to have urges to binge and thoughts and obsessions around eating and so on. And so it's the beginning of the healing process. I love it.
And are you, when working with clients, you're bringing in lots of the principles of intuitive eating, or that comes later on once they're out of those more difficult first stages?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so actually, one of the things, regardless of what kind of individual I'm working with in terms of their eating disorder, whether it's a medical thing, one of the things we have to ask is this person capable? Are they capable of intuitive eating? And when I ask that question, or I'm asking of myself when I'm doing an assessment, I'm not referring to intelligence. I mean, more is it, can they hear hunger and fullness? Can they respond in a timely manner? And quite often the answer is no. When they're in the throes of an eating disorder, usually in that first stage, we're looking at nutrition rehabilitation. And when you have a lot of anxiety around eating, that in of itself can affect perceptions of hunger and fullness. And then when you have malnutrition from chronic restriction, you could literally try and eat according to hunger and fullness, but it would not be enough in terms of what the body is actually needing. And so I try and integrate some of the principles, but usually in the nutrition rehabilitation phase, we're really looking at some kind of prescriptive plan, but I'm still working together in a very collaborative nature. But even when someone is really, really sick, we never start them off where they need to be as far as the total energy or calories. But what I ask them to do is, as this week is unfolding, because I usually will be seeing them at least weekly, is to pay attention to where they might be experiencing signs of hunger, because I would much rather have their body direct the process than for me to randomly say, well, let's add this food here and when. And what this does in a collaborative way, it gets them starting to pay attention. We start the conversations of like, well, what does hunger feel like in your body? And they might say, I don't know. And if I'm working with someone who is someone with bulimia or someone with compulsive eating, they might describe being terrified of hunger. And when I ask why, quite commonly the answer is, well, it's because I try to avoid it or ignore it. And then invariably what ends up happening, it gets to be so intense and so urgent, it can trigger a binge. Or working with someone with anorexia, they might get to the point where they feel pride about hunger, and the longer that they can hold off on that, the more pride they feel in their eating disorder. Or they might have distortions, this idea that the only time you can eat is if you're on the verge of passing out or something. So those are some of the things that we look at.
Yeah, and look, I think I find that with clients I work with as well, that there's certain points where it's like, intuitive eating isn't going to work at this stage because you don't have the feedback, or the feedback has been blocked for so long to be able to listen to that. And for some people, it's like, I'm either a 0 out of 10 in terms of hunger, or I'm a 10 out of 10. There's nothing in between. And just often it's getting that structure in place where people are regularly eating and doing those things, and then starting to tap into some of the intuitive eating stuff. But yeah, a lot of the time people just aren't at the place where they can start there.
Well, yeah. In fact, as you mentioned, that an analogy I often use is like when you have an eating disorder, it's like you have a broken hunger and satiety meter. It's like having a broken arm. And when you have a broken arm, you need some structure for that healing, which is usually in the form of a cast. And the goal is not to keep the cast on for a lifetime. It's just to help support the healing. And once the healing is in place and the arm is good on its own, then you might start the physical therapy and the rest of the treatment to fully recover and heal the arm. And the same thing with an eating disorder. And so these are things that we do talk about in the beginning so they can know that these are things to look forward to in the near future. But, with some patients early on, we are also dealing with a lot of fear foods. There's a lot of terror, unfortunately, with eating certain types of foods to the point of Oh my God, it's profound anxiety. And so we start looking at, it would be like the third principle of intuitive eating, making peace with food, which means eating whatever food that you would like, with attunement. But when you're working with someone with an eating disorder who has all this terror, we might be looking at just getting some ordinary foods back into their pattern of eating and figuring out what those might be and working kind of in a stepped fashion so we're not unnecessarily scaring somebody.
Yeah, no, definitely. So look, we are talking a lot about intuitive eating, and I just want to be mindful of maybe people who haven't read the book or don't know what we're chatting about. I think a lot of my audience will, but I guess, are you able to give a little bit of a rundown of what it is all about for someone who hasn't heard of this concept before?
Yeah, that's actually that's a good question. So I describe it many ways. So one way of looking at it is, first of all, this is about you being the expert of your body, and only you can know if you're hungry, if you're full, or what foods will satisfy. And basically, it's about listening and honoring your body. And it's really a dynamic, integrative process where there's 10 principles. And if you like, I could discuss the principles just briefly. So we're all on this. Yeah,
that would be helpful.
Okay, so the first principle is rejecting the diet mentality, and that's this idea that not only that diets don't work, but that they actually create bigger problems. It's probably one of the most shocking things my patients will say to me that they've learned, and that is that diets actually can cause more weight gain. And the research is profound on that. But what's so fascinating is that when someone's been chronically dieting, they invariably can try to turn intuitive eating into a form of dieting. And the way they can tell is once they start using all or none or pass or fail. And with intuitive eating, it's a process that you constantly are learning from. So the first principle is rejecting the diet mentality. And that includes even eating in certain ways that might not have the word diet in the title, but the moment you're starting to eliminate certain foods and food groups and being disconnected from your own hunger and fullness, that's a clue that you're doing something that's, dieting like. Yeah. The second principle is honoring your hunger. It's pretty straightforward. And that is basically, but it requires knowing what hunger feels like, what biological hunger feels like in your body. And it also means trusting it. The third principle is making peace with food. And I think it's probably one of the most controversial and misunderstood principles of intuitive eating. And yet it's one of the biggest hallmarks of intuitive eating. And what this is, it's basically eating whatever food you like with attunement. And people who are not familiar with this, including health professionals, will say, oh my gosh, if you do that, they're going to get unhealthy or they're going to gain weight. And actually, when you actually look at the research, there's been over 60 studies so far on intuitive eating showing really positive associations and or benefits. It's actually quite exciting. And what's fascinating, even though intuitive eating, the intention of intuitive eating is about overall health, it's not about weight or weight loss, is every study that has looked at intuitive eating and body mass index, and as you know, the body mass index is fraught with problems. Yep. Every study that has looked at this has shown that intuitive eaters have a lower body mass index without internalizing the thin ideal. And the reason I get a little bit, I have to be careful how I say this, I get a little bit excited about that data is because for those who have fears that, oh my gosh, if I eat whatever I want, it means I'm going to gain weight. It's like, actually, no, the research shows just the opposite. It seems to be kind of a nice, stable thing. So that's really key. And then when someone's been chronically dieting, they can't imagine, though. They'll say, well, I would never stop eating chocolate. I'll never stop eating cookies or biscuits or so on. And when someone says something like that, that actually reflects more of their deprivation, because the truth is, how would it feel to be eating these foods all the time, every day, Yep. But someone who's been chronically dieting doesn't know that because they've had all these rules, and food remains exciting. And this principle is based on the research of habituation, which shows that the more we're exposed to something novel, novel meaning it's new in the beginning, but the more exposure, the less of a big deal it is with time. And probably the classic example of that is Actually, I think it's a classic. I love it. It's like when you're falling in love for the first time and you hear your significant other say, "I love you." It can be so magical and so wonderful. But after you're used to being in a relationship with that person, let's say 5 years down the road, and that same person says, "I love you," it's very nice to hear, but it doesn't have that same magical quality. And so the same thing with food. And when you know you can eat whatever you want, you really get to ask, do I really want this food now? If I eat this food now, am I going to enjoy it? Or maybe, do I like how this food even feels in my body? So it gives you a lot of freedom. So it's a paradox of unconditional permission. When you have unconditional permission to eat, the paradox is you end up eating less food.
Yeah. And I mean, the example I always give for this is I've had a very normal inverted commas, history with food. I've never dieted. It's not part of my history, but I remember going on holidays when I was a kid, and we would always go a lot of the time to a resort, and we'd be there for a week or for 10 days, and they'd have a buffet, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it was always like that first buffet for breakfast on that first day, I ate more than at any other point. And then as the holiday went on, the novelty of eating that food just wore off. So by the end, I'm like, I can't wait to go home and just eat some normal everyday food. And it wasn't about fear or chastising myself or anything. It's like the novelty of this is worn thin. Like having donuts for breakfast after doing it for a week just isn't that fun.
Yeah. That's actually a great example. In fact, as you're saying that too, I will often ask my patients if they've ever had this experience in their life. And sometimes growing up, they've had that experience maybe when they were kids, or if they've never had that experience because they were chronically dieting, is do they know anyone in their lives where they've witnessed this so they can see that actually it's true, but it can be a really scary idea. Yeah. When you've only known chronic dieting. The fifth principle is respecting your fullness. That's pretty straightforward, but yet complex. It's about stopping when you feel like you're no longer hungry, and it's a comfortable feeling of satiation. But I find that a lot of people struggle with this. But the cool thing is there's no pass or fail. So let's say you end up eating too much. Rather than panicking and trying to micromanage this and vow that you're going to eat less at the next meal, let's see what your body would naturally do. Maybe your body will be naturally less hungry, for example, at dinner time. But if someone's constantly compensating, they're not going to see this. And what this does is it ends up eroding trust. The sixth principle of intuitive eating is a really important one. It's kind of the hub of intuitive eating, and that has to do with discovering the satisfaction factor. And it's hard to put this into words, but one way of looking at this, it has to do with pleasure, that feel-good feeling when you finish eating. And what I find for a lot of people, it's a very novel idea. Sometimes in the very beginning, I might suggest as a first step is to aim for satisfaction in their meals. Because if you think about it, to undereat is not very satisfying, and to overeat ultimately is not satisfying either. And so it's actually a principle that gets somebody into balance, but in a pleasurable way. And so many people have had experiences where it's been painful, eating a certain way in the name of health or something like that. So it's really kind of a revolutionary idea. The seventh principle is honoring your feelings without food, which is basically about coping with your feelings and your emotions without turning to food. And while that sounds very straightforward, it can be really complex. And it's fascinating when you look at the research that shows that just the act of dieting, there's something unique about dieting that makes a person more vulnerable to cope with their feelings through using food. And I find that's important to recognize so people don't feel like there's something particularly crazy about them, because there's a lot of shame involved around this. The eighth principle is respecting your body. And we were really careful when we used that description. At the time when we wrote the book, it was published, the first one was in 95. It was really common among health professionals, especially therapists, to support the idea of loving your body. But what we found was so many of our patients, a lot of them are women, they were at war with their bodies. They hated their bodies. And so when you started bringing up this idea of love, they were like, are you kidding me? They couldn't even hear it. It was such a perverse idea to them. So we started using the description of respect, and we found that we're able to get buy-in with that. This is going to be your home for the rest of your life, and you might not like your body, you might actually hate your body, but can we start to build some respect where you'd be willing to respect your body, to treat it in a nice way? And this is one principle I find it's one of the longest ones to get resolved, because there's been so much body shame and body bashing that's promoted in our culture, and that it becomes part of a belief system and a value system. And so what I find is in the beginning, we can get what I would call intellectual buy-in. It's like, yeah, I think it's important to respect your body, or I want my kids to grow up and respect their bodies. But emotionally, they haven't integrated yet, and that takes a while. And I think it's important to know that it takes some time when you've been bashing your body all your life, that for you to really internalize it. And that's really okay. And so one of the things I do, it's this little activity, is I don't want to minimize how someone feels in their body. Because I'll never forget, I had a patient say, Evelyn, I have a very big body, and you have no idea how uncomfortable it is to be me. And she went on to describe how just to try and bend over her to tie her shoes was very, very difficult because her stomach was so much in the way and the discomfort. And so what I realized in my striving to help people respect their body, that I was inadvertently minimizing their experience, and that's the last thing I want to do. Yeah. So what I have them do is something where they can own their experience, where I feel uncomfortable in my body. Okay, that's a fact. It's not bashing it, but it's saying something that's true. And then I do what I call AND therapy, A-N-D. And then I have them list 3 things they respect about themselves that has nothing to do with appearance. And so it might be, I'm having a challenging body day and I'm a great teacher. I'm having a challenging body day and I'm really smart. I'm having a challenging body day and I'm a really good listener. And so what this does, it accepts how you're feeling physically, but it doesn't discount you, and it doesn't tie up all your identity just into your body. And I find it can be really, really healing. And so sometimes I jokingly will say, give me 3. Give me 3 examples, and we do this kind of routinely. And then the last 2 principles of intuitive eating. The 9th is, exercising it's about feeling the difference. It's about feeling the joy of movement and really decoupling it from this idea of weight loss. And the research is really profound about this. And, the scientists have been saying, people, we have to disconnect exercise from weight loss, because it ends up making people feeling so discouraged if that's the only reason why they're exercising. And as you know, Chris, there are so many other benefits to exercising, from mood to cardiovascular health and so on and so on. And so I find for a lot of people, for the first time, it's about finding something that they really enjoy doing, as opposed to exercising in a way that burns the most calories, know? And that can take a while. And then the 10th principle is honoring your health with gentle nutrition. So, it's interesting. Intuitive eating includes nutrition, but what I find with the media, the novelty about eating whatever food you want with attunement is a very exciting thing to write about or to have on a TV show. That it gets a lot of attention, but health is still an important part of this. And there's something we call body food choice congruence. And what this is, it's also about knowing how foods feel in your body and how they energize your body, as opposed to choosing foods for the purpose of trickery. Trickery would be doing things like, trying to trick your body into feeling full, like eating a bunch of lettuce when here you are, you're meal hungry or something like that. And so I've had patients, ironically, feel a little distressed or even guilty when they start wanting to choose healthier foods in this process. And I'll ask them, why do you feel distressed about this? And they'll say, I'm afraid I'm going back to dieting. It's like, we have to about what's the intention behind the action. And that's one way I look at it. So in a nutshell, those are your 10 principles. And I got to tell you, Chris, we got really, really lucky. When we wrote the book proposal, Our publisher, actually, we had several publishers interested in the book, but the publisher we ultimately went with said, we love it. We love the concept, but what we'd like you to do is to turn it into steps or something, make it more how-to. And I'll tell you, that was brilliant. So we created the 10 principles around our concepts that we had. But what this did, it made it measurable. And the research that has come out, because now there's an intuitive eating assessment scale that Tracy Tickle created in 2006 and then updated it in 2013 to include, she's done it, I think, on almost like over 5,000 people, if I have the numbers correct. But looking at, can we measure this? The answer is yes. And then 2, does it make a difference? And the answer is yes, it does. It's actually really exciting to see all the research coming out showing health benefits and health indicators and showing that this could actually be really the way to go. There's even public policy now here in the United States. There's we have 50 states. There's a state called Utah.
Yep.
For those of you who don't know geography, that actually has incorporated intuitive eating into their public health policy because they see the harm of dieting it more important, that this is actually a way to go. And there's been some interesting research out of Italy that has shown that, maybe the missing factor in a lot of our health policy is we haven't connected it to the people in terms of, are you hungry? Are you full? Is this satisfying? So ultimately, it becomes more empowering. And I think that's what's so, exciting about this. And then, at a deeper level, an area of research I'm really, really excited about it's called interceptive awareness. Okay. And interceptive awareness, that's a mouthful, and a lot of people might not be familiar with it, so I want to define what it is. Yep. It's basically our body's ability to perceive physical sensations that arise from within the body. And you're thinking, okay, so what? But here's what's really cool about this, is that when you look at the principles of intuitive eating, it's either working to improve that awareness of these physical sensations, or it's working to remove the obstacles, and the obstacles come from the mind. So let me give you some examples. So, when you have a full bladder or a rapid heart rate, you can feel that. That's an example of interceptive awareness. Yeah. Feeling hunger and fullness is another example. But the one that blows me away is that every emotion has a physical sensation that goes with it. And so if you think about it, that as people become more attuned to the physical sensations of their body, it gives them powerful, powerful information about how to get their needs met. And so not surprisingly, there's been a fair amount of research now coming out on intuitive eating and interceptive awareness. And sure enough, intuitive eaters have a higher level of interceptive awareness. And so I just find this really, really exciting. But what makes it complex is we're living in such a time of distractions, yep. that in order to hear the direct experience of our body, it requires a bit of stillness. And if you're having a meal, that might mean for some people turning off the TV, putting their smartphones away, and so on and so on. And years ago, when I would ask someone to eat without distraction, they would be like, okay, And now if I ask somebody, it's like I'm asking them to give away their firstborn or something. It's like, oh my God, what do I do? So we talk about things they can do while they're eating, and by that I mean ways to pay attention to the sensory qualities of eating, whether it's the taste or the aroma or the texture, and so on and so on.
Wow. And one of the big things I want to find out is, if we go back to 1995, which is when the book originally came out, what was the diet book landscape like at that time? And was anyone remotely talking about listening to your body and the intuitive eating ethos, or were you really the only people who were doing that?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, dieting was happening big time, but there was actually a pretty big movement of something called non-dieting, the non-dieting approach. And it was something that dietitians and therapists had been advocating. There's a therapist team called Hirschman and Munter out of Chicago, and they were advocating that. Janine Roth is a pretty well-known person. She's a consumer who's written a lot of books on this. Her approach is non-dieting. So actually, that's something we also did. We looked at their work, and we also looked at the research in terms of, is there research that might support this idea? And in the non-dieting community, there was a fair amount going on, but when you use terms like non-dieting, it's like, well, what is that?
Yeah.
But then what really influenced us too was the work of Leanne Birch, LL Birch. She did a lot of research on the child, the dynamic relationship of feeding, parent, child. And that's where we really modeled the intuitive eating after was that. But the other thing that was happening in the research world was a lot of work looking at restraint. It was called restrained eating or restraint eaters.
Yep.
And that was forth by Herman and Polivy, Janet Polivy out of Toronto. And basically it was a 10-question assessment that really talked about, is basically dieters, that they have this profound, they called it the counter-regulation effect. I remember reading this and all this like big research stuff.
Was this with like different like milkshake and ice cream studies? I think they've tested that out.
Yeah, exactly. And as they were describing their theory, and this counter-regulation effect, where if you tell a bunch of dieters that this shake has a lot of calories, they're going to end up overeating the shake. But if you tell them that there's low calories in it, that they won't, even though they've done all this trickery where there weren't much calories in it to begin with. And so they were fascinated by this because what they described in this paper, which really got my attention, is they call it the what the hell effect, basically, of dieting. It's like, oh my God, when I read that, these are my patients. These are my patients. And so that's what was going on back at that time. And so they talked about what happens is that these people have this great restraint. They have these rules around their eating, and they're eating according to the rules. But something comes along to break that restraint. It can be an emotion. It can be the perception of breaking a rule. And then, boom, all hell breaks loose. And they're not connected at all to what's going on with their body. So that research had a really profound impact, too, on our model. Greatly so. So there was a lot of things happening. So there was a lot of foundational work that was going on before we came up with this aspect. I think we were the first to kind of really document it in a way with the research, but to put it into an applied practice. And the thing that's been so exciting is so funny. If you go back in history, since you mentioned history, it was like around 2006. That's when the research really started taking off. There had been a couple studies, but that's when Tracy's big study got published. And that was the year that we got a lot of media attention, even though this is like 7 years later, but a celebrity in the United States had just come out of a treatment center for an eating disorder and had been raving about intuitive eating. I ended up doing an interview with People magazine, and I told them, I don't talk about who I see. And they say, no, this person has not seen you, but they've read your book, and it's going to be our cover story. And when they called me up to fact check the story, I remember telling Elyse, Elyse, we better get a website, because if this is on the cover story, this is going to get big. And it did. So what happened is we got suddenly all this media attention worldwide, and then we got the attention of research. And I have to tell you, I think I was more excited about the research aspect of it because it continues to be really a valid way to be working with people.
Wow. And in terms of just going back in history as well, like looking at the clients that you were getting back when you first started out to the kind of clients that you're getting now, how has that changed? And I guess that probably the landscape around like personal development and people working with practitioners has changed during that time. But I just would be interested to find out how your client makeup has changed, or the types of people who are seeing you now versus then.
That's an excellent question. No one's ever asked me that, so I can actually answer that for you. So in the beginning, I would say it was chronic dieters or people trying to lose weight, having problems, and I'd be working with them with the intuitive eating model. Fast forward, what's different today, and by the way, I'd have to be doing a lot of advocacy around why this works, because people didn't know about intuitive eating, even though we were using the model of intuitive eating. Yeah. But what's happening today is people know intuitive eating. Many times they've already have read the book, and they'll say, this really makes sense. Your case studies resonate with me. It felt like you were talking about me and all your stories. And they'll say, I really, really want to do this, but I'm afraid. and I don't trust that my body will work, and they need more support. So I'd say that's what I see more of now, where people are already familiar with the model, so I don't have to, when I want to say talk them into it,
yeah.
they're already familiar with it. But the other thing I'd tell you I see that's a lot different now than back then is the complexity, and that is with the orthorexia. And for those of your listeners not familiar, orthorexia is a term. It's not an official diagnosis, but it's really well recognized. And it's a term that describes people who are so focused and fixated on healthy eating. They have rigid rules around the eating to the point that they become unhealthy. And I wouldn't be surprised to see this actually as a bona fide eating disorder the next time all that stuff gets revised in the DSM.
Yeah.
So what I see happen, so now I'll get somebody who comes in and they'll say, I don't eat gluten, and they don't have celiac disease. I don't eat gluten. I don't do dairy. I have to have raw food, and I'm a vegan, And then to look at all these things, and it's so complex. Well, why do you eat this way? How did this evolve? And for the great majority of people I see, these actually happen as a consequence of trying to eat in a way to lose more weight. And so it's not serving them. If someone's a vegan because they have philosophical values and so on, I'm not gonna argue or try to dissuade them from that. But once you start adding all these other aspects, that it has to be raw, that it has to be a certain way, it really, really limits your options. But what ends up happening, I guess what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way, I think today the fear is so much more profound than it was back then. And it's almost as, because back then you never heard the description clean eating. I want to be a clean eater. Yeah. And I have to tell you, personally, it drives me crazy because it sounds like, you're trying to absolve or purify yourself. And so sometimes when I've done interviews on this and people ask me about it, I'll say, well, I'm a very dirty eater. Wanted to get their attention, but I say, some of the healthiest foods come from the earth. They're full of dirt, like carrots and root vegetables and so on and so on. So when a war has been called on obesity, like a holy war, if you will, it would make sense then that people are going to almost a religious it's almost like evangelism in terms of how people are eating, and they're afraid to eat any differently. And so the fear is what I see is so profound, that something bad's going to really happen if they don't eat in this way. So working with this, and sometimes getting people to understand, when you start looking at the research, even around scary things like around cancer and so on, that a lot of this research is association-based, and it's making assumptions that if you eat this way every single day for 70 years, And so it's about finding that middle road for somebody, but also looking at, health is more than just what you eat. It also includes psychological health. And if you're spending a lot of time and a lot of anxiety worrying about what you're eating, or turning down social events because of the food that's going to be there, you're missing out on your own life. Or you're in a conversation with somebody, but your mind is busy calculating the carbs or the calories, it means you weren't there. It's like when you're on the phone with somebody, you can tell they're checking email. They're participating in the conversation. They're saying the right things, but there's something missing. That's what happens when someone's chronically dieting or eating according to some kind of rules. And so that's something I have them take a look at. Like, what's happening to your quality of life here? And that can be really disturbing when you look at that this, is a problem.
Yeah. And it also means that people make choices in a very myopic way, where it is solely about, is this going to make me lose weight or put on weight, as opposed to like, what is the exercise that I'm going to do that I'm actually going to enjoy, or what is the food that I'm going to eat that are actually going to give me the energy or is going to nourish me, or whatever it may be. It becomes very blinkered in how people assess things, and it becomes very much about short term as opposed to long-term health or long-term longevity, etc.
Yeah. And again, and also at the risk of disconnecting them more and more with their body. And so that's why this trust issue really, keeps coming up, that, when someone is hungry and then what they're constantly doing is eating lettuce, and maybe for half an hour that works, but then they're hungry again, it creates this big anxiety. So one of the things I'll say is like, every time you honor your hunger with real food, you're building trust with every single bite of food that you put into your body, Or if it turns out that, you're in the mood for a salad, but every time you do that, you're hungry an hour later, you get to ask, is this ultimately satisfying? Do I like eating in this way and being hungry every hour? And if the answer is no, well, then we need to be looking at this in a different way. And I can't tell you the patients I've had that have been so surprised when they discover, if they're willing, and it takes courage, to eat a little more food than what they might be having at, say, at a classic lunchtime, that, wow, it sustains you for such a longer period of time, and you're not thinking about food all the time, because when your body's not hungry, it's not trying to get your attention, to feed it.
Yeah. And so with the original book that was released in 95, you've now released, I think the third edition then came out in 2012. If we were to go back and look at the different editions, what are the things that have evolved over time? What are things that have been dropped out? What are parts that have been added in?
That's a really good question. I would say it's been an evolution. And maybe the best way to answer that is we actually have a new book coming out in the spring, April 1st, 2017. Yep. And it's actually a workbook, the Intuitive Eating Workbook. We've been getting so much demand from this, from our readers and from health practitioners. So this is so funny. It's so funny. After we signed a contract with our publisher, they say to us, we want it to really stand alone. And Elyse and I really had the idea that this would be a companion to intuitive eating. We thought, what? If it's got to stand alone, let's update this. And so here's what we discovered. And actually, we knew this, but we had great conversations about this. And that is, if we had started writing intuitive eating today, there would have been an 11th principle. And that 11th principle would have been self-care. Because if people's basic self-care is not there, if they're not getting enough sleep, if they're not having enough downtime, if they're so stressed out, they're not going to really hear hunger and let alone respond in a timely manner. And many times with our patients, we're working on these issues before we even get into the actual intuitive eating. The other thing we really, really have updated is this whole thing around interceptive awareness. Again, the ability to hear physical sensations that arise from within your body. And in this workbook, we have a lot of physical activities that people do to help them get connected with that. The other thing that's been updated, actually in the last book and this one too, because this drives me crazy, is the controversy around food addiction. And the reason it drives me crazy is it adds this fear that, oh my gosh, I'm addicted to food, therefore I can't eat, and you fill in the blank, sugar, white flour, whatever it happens to be. Yeah. Yet when you start taking a careful look at the research really doesn't indicate any kind of clear addiction at all. When you look at the animal studies that really got this looked at in a serious manner from scientists out of Princeton, I think it was in the 90s or was it the 2000s? Anyways, it was out of Princeton looking at rats, in which they took rats and gave them access to all this sugary food and, quote, created an addiction. But there was a very important method to that study, and that is they had another group of rats who were exposed to the same kind of sugar, and they got to eat regularly. The group of rats that so-called had the sugar addiction, they starved them for 12 hours. And that's a missing aspect when you start looking at the so-called food addiction. When you look at binge eating studies and you look at the risk of dieting and relationship to binge eating, it's really, really profound. When you look at the brain imaging studies that have come out saying, oh, these people are addicted to food, many times they have not controlled for hunger, they have not controlled for dieting. And what happens is when you're hungry, the food's going to be more rewarding. When you're hungry, you're going to have more attention to that. And that's what you see in these brain imaging studies. And what really got me looking at some of this stuff is when you look at other conditions. There was a study done in 2011 in which they took people who have a physiological response to music. They get goosebumps, or it's called furls, F-U-R-L. Like it rhymes with curls, but with an F. Yep. You get goosebumps. So they took these people and they did a brain imaging study and they looked at their dopamine and they exposed them to music. And what they found was merely the anticipation of music, upped up their dopamine. And then hearing this beautiful music lit up the cocaine euphoria region in the brain. And yet in this research, the scientists are not saying, oh my God, you can be addicted to music. They're not even thinking about that. So as a habit now, when I'm at conferences, and I usually go to the neurology section when they're looking at food addiction issues, I will go up to the microphone and I ask one question of the scientist, and I will ask, did you control? And the usual answer 99% of the time is no, they did not. And if they did not, that's a huge confounder. Now, there's a researcher up in Oregon in the United States who actually did a brain imaging study where he did control for dieting. He took a group of girls who were dieting, a group of girls who did not, did a brain imaging study around food. And what they found is, yep, the ones who were dieting had more attention and more focus on food. So it's really a controversial area at best. And it's important to remember that there's other things that can cause these urgent, intense desires to eat. Good old hunger will also do that, but so can learned conditioning, like with Pavlov's dogs. He rang a bell, gave the dogs a cookie, rang a bell, gave the dogs a cookie, and after a while, merely ringing a bell, they salivated because they thought they were getting cookies. But an important component of this study was a part 2 study where he would ring a bell and not give them a treat, and after a while, there was no learned association at all. And so the reason I get really concerned about this is I hate for people to be label themselves as powerless over food. And for example, when you take a look at the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which has been, oh my gosh, there's been so much research now on this. When you look at the actual scale and the questions really reflect consequences of dieting. Are you constantly thinking about food? And when I first read this study, I remember thinking, how in the world do you get statistical food addiction in a normal population? Because this was done on the college kids going to Yale. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. If you think about half of the women are dieting, a third of the men are dieting, according to, dieting incidence kinds of studies, then I thought, oh, this would make sense. You would have this kind of obsessionality with food. And so I think between the brain imaging studies and this Yale Food Addiction Scale, it might give the average person the perception that, yeah, food addiction is a significant problem for people. And the reason I get concerned about it, because then, I have researchers trying to find the drug that can stop it, when actually, when we're looking at the cause, one of the root causes really appears to be dieting and food restriction, and it misses that whole picture. So that's an issue that we talk about in our updates of intuitive eating. To answer your simple question with a complex answer.
No, that's great. And look, your answer around food addiction was amazing. I mean, I really don't like that term, and I think it's born out of the fact, as you say, that people diet or they restrict. And so, yeah, I think that was amazing. So look, Evelyn, I'm really loving chatting with you, but I also want to be respectful of time. So before we wrap this up, where can people go to connect with you or find out more information? I'm going to put everything in the show notes, but if you can just tell people where to go, that would be great.
Yeah, a couple of things. Our official website is intuitiveeating.org, so you can go there for lots of information. But what I'm so excited about is we also have the Intuitive Eating online community, which you can also access from there. And we have over 10,000 people from all over the world who share their experiences with intuitive eating. And once a month, we have one of our certified intuitive eating counselors who do chats on one of the principles. So that would be a great place to get support. We also have a Facebook page where we just try and update information as it comes about. So those are some ways that you can connect with us.
Okay, perfect. Well, as I said, I'll put all of that in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on today. As I mentioned at the start, I really do love your book, and it's had a huge impact on me and how I work. So thank you for sharing all the extra information today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.